Thank you for being here today to Photo Kathmandu 3rd edition. It's the second day of opening weekend talks. I'll start by saying just turn off your phones or put them on silent mode. We have 2 talks lined up for you guys today. Right now we'll be starting with Memory in the Time of Loss with Jennifer Bradley, who's from Langtang Memory Project, in conversation with Diwas. And the second talk at 5:30 will be by Dennis. She'll be presenting on A Pillar of Smoke, Notes from Contemporary Turkey. So a short introduction of our speakers today. Jennifer Bradley is the co-facilitator of the Langtang Memory Project. Jennifer lives in Kathmandu right now. She's been working for the past 3 years on cultural documentation projects aimed at collaborating with the Langtang community archiving to preserve the cultural heritage that could be potentially lost and document the post-disaster context that the Langtang Pass continues to navigate. Jennifer is primarily interested in ethnographic and participatory methods. She has worked in a variety of other projects. She's been in Nepal for a while now, and she's deeply interested in gender issues and foregrounding women's voices where they may otherwise not be heard. And Diwas Raja Kc, he's a researcher, writer, and curator based in Kathmandu. He pursued graduate studies in visual culture and history at Sarah Lawrence College, New York, and University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. At Nepal Picture Library, he continues on building visual archives and presenting documentary images of historically obscured subjects. His curatorial show, Dalit, A Quest for Dignity, which was in 2016, explored ways of witnessing assertions and, I don't know how to pronounce this word.
Which is what?
Obfuscations. Okay, good, thanks. About Dalit past in Nepal. He also works as a documentary film editor and has worked with several renowned artists and visual anthropologists. Diwas gives workshops on visual storytelling and has taught courses on social history and historiographical methods. So, to you.
Thanks. Hold on. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So those of you who were in attendance at yesterday's talks would have noted that currently we're feeling a lot of need to talk about remembering and forgetting. And our conversation today will be another instance for that. I don't think it is by accident that the Feminist Memory Project that is being helmed by the Nepal Picture Library, in which I'm involved, and the Langtang Memory Project, the titles that we have come up with separately to describe what we are doing, that they sound so similar, what we call memory projects. Hopefully today's talk can shed some light on this business of making memory into projects. Both the Feminist Memory Project and the Langtang Memory Project are in essence archive building projects. Yesterday too, we heard a fair deal about archives. Not too long ago, we used to hear about archives as this specific dust-filled spaces of basically provinces of historians and literary scholars from where they produced their turgid wisdoms. But now we all seem to have got this sort of what we come to call the archive fever. And archive has now come to become this sort of crossover success story. Both the Feminist Memory Project and the Langtang Memory Project are instances, in a way, of the swelling of small and big archival projects that we are hearing about from everywhere. And we seem to be witnessing the emergence of a new moment, in a way, that is focused on examining our collective relationship with the documentary, with testimonials, and rethinking how to make sense of the world through fragments, traces, memories, anecdotes, incomplete drafts, and things like that. I propose that as the broader sort of context for today's talk with Jennifer. earlier when we sat down, we were trying to figure out how the two projects, the Feminist Memory Project and the Langtang Memory Project, might be usefully related for our conversation today. What to make of this space apart from sort of spreading the contagion of the archive fever that both our teams seem to be suffering from. So what I have proposed to Jennifer is that I will ask her some questions about the Langtang Memory Project based on my experience and inquiries from working on the Feminist Memory Project. Though before we get to the conversation, we felt it might help if Jennifer took a little time to talk about her work, her project, which back in 2015, when the earthquake had just hit, we all heard about the incredible destruction and loss of life in the Langtang Valley. But most of us probably haven't kept up with the developments among the Langtampas in the last 3.5 years. So I've asked Jennifer to start by talking about the Langtang experience, give us a sense of the scale of destruction and loss, and tell us about the Langtang Memory Project that came about afterwards.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennifer Bradley, and as Diwas said, I'm the co-facilitator of the Langtang Memory Project. So I'm going to take about 10 minutes to try to give everyone some context on Langtang itself, what happened, and the project that we're involved in. The Langtang Memory Project is a living archive and collaborative documentation effort that came about in the wake of the April 25th, 2015 earthquakes. So, this picture taken by David Brashear gives a little bit of a sense of what happened in Langtang. The top picture is before the earthquake and after the earthquake. The earthquake caused a large avalanche in Langtang, and it covered almost an entire village, almost the entire Langtang village. So Langtang lies in the upper part of Raswa district in the Himalayan region of Nepal. The people from Langtang follow a Tibetan-based culture and Buddhist religion. Their language is also a dialect of Tibetan. In recent history, Langtang has become a popular trekking destination due to its landscape and mountains. However, the landscape of Langtang has been forever changed since the tragedy of April 25, 2015. On that day, an earthquake ravaged Nepal and subsequently caused an avalanche in Langtang that released almost half the force of the Hiroshima atomic bomb. Over 300 people were killed, including 180 local people. That was nearly half of the community at the time. It was in every sense of the word a tragedy that continues to mark the lives of the Langtampas today, almost 3.5 years later. Every person from Langtang lost someone close to them. Directly after the earthquake, news about what had happened in Langtang had not reached Kathmandu. Phones were not working, and Langtampas living in Kathmandu spent many days waiting in the airport, hoping to see familiar faces arrive on helicopters. Some were reunited, but many were met with the news that their family members would not be arriving in Kathmandu. The Langtampas were displaced from their homeland directly following the earthquake. The government deemed the area a danger zone, and no one was allowed to live there. The survivors of the community came to Kathmandu at that time, where the Yellow Gumba and Swayambhu allowed the displaced community to set up temporary shelters on their ground. It was a time of complete disorientation. The community was devastated. Many elders from the community, not accustomed to Kathmandu's climate and lifestyle, found this living arrangement extremely difficult. 6 months after, some Langtampas returned to Langtang, hoping to find some sense of direction, some way of rebuilding what they had lost. Many homes were destroyed. Now it has been over 3 years since the earthquake. The rebuilding process is coming to an end for some, while others still haven't been able to rebuild their family homes again. Following in the Buddhist tradition, the religious and community leaders, along with other Langtampas, collectively made the decision to observe 3 years of condolences. This meant no singing, no dancing, no celebrating, and no festivals during this time. It was a time of mourning, a time of praying for those who passed away to move on to their next lives. In the Buddhist philosophy, when a person dies, that person enters into a state called bardo. At that time, the person who passed away does not yet know that they have died. They can still see their family, they'll enter their homes, and they'll try to have conversations. It's a time of complete anxiety because their families are not talking to them. Only after some time, after they realize no one will respond to them, they realize that they have died. In this sense, it's important for the families of the person who passed away to do their best to show their strength at this time. It is common to hear Langtangpas talking about the importance of not crying, not showing too much sadness. This is because if they show these feelings outwardly, the person who passed away will also see this. In response, they will feel bad as well. They will want to stay with their loved ones, meaning they will not be able to move on to their next life. This process is a practice of detachment. Attachment after death is considered to be detrimental to the person who has passed, but the question remains, how can one move on after such a tragedy? After so many have died, how can one detach themselves? During the period of Bardo, there are pujas every 7 days for the first 49 days. The final puja, called a Gewa, is held on the last day. After this, it is believed that the person has moved on to their next life, and a type of celebration follows. However, this case is unique. Not just one person died, not just one family is in mourning, an entire community is in mourning. Due to this, the Langtangpas have been mourning in a more formal way, together. Each year since the earthquake, during this time of community-imposed condolences, there has been a formal community-wide puja on the anniversary of the earthquake. These pujas last the entire day. The lamas lead the community in mantras and prayer. Butter lamps are lit in order to give light to the people who passed away to find the path to the next life. The last puja marked the end of the 3-year condolence period. Now the Langtangpas are entering into a new phase in the post-disaster context, a phase in which they are singing again, dancing again, and observing their festivals and rituals, trying to resume life as it was before the earthquake. However, the losses are still palpable. The newly rebuilt houses continue to remind the Langtangpas of the traditional houses they no longer have. The avalanche zone, that takes about 25 minutes to walk over by foot, continues to remind the community of the tragedy that occurred. The people still look for the familiar faces inside of dancing circles and at festivals, faces that will never come back. This is a loss that will continue to mark the lives and the landscape of Langtang, left only with memories of those who passed away and the photos of landscapes that once were. So in the wake of this earthquake, in the context that I just explained, the Langtang Memory Project emerged. It's a collaborative effort to create a living archive that speaks to the place, culture, and people of Langtang. This is an effort to rebuild the social and cultural dynamics of Langtang, to preserve and document the Langtang identity that the community feels may be lost, and to create spaces for remembrance and reflection. The project initiates intergenerational dialogue and knowledge exchange. Working with the community, we have provided workshops to offer visual and audio documentation skills, encouraging the Langtangpas to tell their own stories, to tell the stories of Langtang by Langtangpas themselves. Through a variety of collaborative visual methods, the project initiates new conversations about the past, the present, and the future of Langtang. Our archive collection includes photographs that date back to the 1960s, some of the oldest documentation that exists of Langtang. We have crowdsourced photos from tourists, Peace Corps volunteers, and other foreigners. These photos have become very special to our collection, evoking memories of Langtang in a more distant past, images that Langtangpas continually ask to view. These memories do not hold the bitterness of photos from just 4 or 5 years ago. Some photos from our archive have been salvaged from the avalanche zone. Others have been scanned directly from family photo albums of Langtangpas themselves. In addition to collecting photos, we have engaged in other visual methods, such as photo voice, in order to equip Langtangpas with the skills to tell their own stories as they see fit. This is part of ongoing documentation in the post-disaster context. The exhibition that we are presenting for Photo Kathmandu is one of the manifestations of the work of the Langtang Memory Project. Our exhibition is called Sempat Zera Kipusho, Memory and Post-Disaster Recovery in the Langtang Valley. With this exhibition, we are trying to explore the state that the Langtangpas find themselves in currently. The first part of the title is a phrase in the Langtang language. One Langtangpa woman has explained Sempat Zera as the following. The people of Langtang, after the earthquake, they use this word a lot. Sempa is your heart and your state of mind, you yourself. Zera means not in a good state. Now, in these days, the people we love are no longer with us. You want to meet them, but you cannot. They are still here in our hearts, but they're not in person. We lost a lot. When we think about it, it's Sempa Zera. You miss them, you want to talk to them, you want to see them, but you cannot do that. It's Sempa Zera. You can do nothing about it. You can do nothing. Now, as more than 3 years have passed since the earthquake, the Langtangpas are trying to continue with their lives. Alongside this sense of Sempat Zera, a new sentiment is emerging. Kipu Sho. In the Langtang language, Kipu is a word that means happiness, a sense of well-being, and Sho is to invite or to welcome. The Langtangpas are now trying to navigate this balance between the two sentiments, wanting to move on, but still holding the feelings of loss. As one Langtangpa explains, in Langtang there is a saying that we shouldn't cry after people's death. If we cry, then they will feel bad, the spirit will feel bad. But when we are happy, they are also happy. We want Kipu to come back to us. We want happiness once again back to us. This is a struggle for balance that the Langtangpas will continue to grapple with as they move past the 3-year condolence period and transition into trying to resume some type of normalcy, trying to find happiness once again in the aftermath of disaster.
So I wanted to begin today's conversation by asking you about memory. I was reading the description of the Langtang Memory Project on your website, as well as the blurb for the upcoming exhibition that's opening at Chaya Center on the 26th of October. And I noticed that you open with this note on remembering as an act of healing. In the Feminist Project as well, we often make the same point, that apart from the intellectual requirements of understanding history in new ways, that there is also perhaps the more urgent need of recovering from trauma and disaster that memory seems to serve. Now, coming from the Feminist Memory Project, I don't know to what extent we can speak of women's lives in general as a condition of disaster. We are aware of the degree of silences around women's lives and the types of silences that Amar Kanwar actually yesterday movingly spoke about traumatic experiences faced by women. So I'm wondering if, even at a metaphorical level, since your work happens around a specific experience of disaster, if you can tell us a little bit in what ways is memory employed for the everyday need of living in the time of loss and disaster, after which we've titled this talk as well. What is it about remembering the past that is useful and productive? You've also talked about how letting people tell their own stories empowers them. How does remembering the past relate to the need or even the capacity to imagine a future, which both the feelings of suffering loss and moving on with life are captured in your exhibition title, which you just elaborated on, which is Sempa Zera Kipusho? Can you talk about that?
Sure. So in the context of Langtang, we see memory employed in lots of different ways. For example, in formal ways of pujas and imposing this 3 years of condolences and having the community agree on that. But there's lots of things that people do every day that employ memory, and that's things that are quite private and maybe no one really talks about it, but waking up in the morning and they place photos on the puja altars and they remember the people who passed away, and they talk about this sense of remembering your death every day. And that's become really highlighted in the context of this disaster, because in the context of doing these interviews with the different women from Langtang, we heard people saying things like that, I look back and after I think about everything that happened, I remember, oh, I did this thing wrong and I said this mean thing to that person and I wasn't nice to that person. And so this type of memory work is also kind of encouraging them to look forward to the future and to try to be better for the people who they lost in the future. That's how they speak about it. And they do these things in the name of these people who passed away. There's also things like when they're doing Kora, like in Boda or Shoyambu, they silently are thinking about these people. When they're lighting by their lamps, they're thinking about these people. So this is the type of memory that they're doing, that they're kind of employing every day. And then to go on to your other question about having Langtang people tell their own stories and kind of equipping them with these skills, I think that it's really important that we have people who are from the community tell the story. Like, there's so many stories that people come from the outside and they come just for the story and then, a week later they completely forget about it. There's a man from Langtang, his name is Lakpa, and he once told me, this was in November of 2016, he told me, I was talking to some people who were so involved in kind of documenting what happened in Langtang, and then it hadn't even been a year since the earthquake, and he was talking to them again, and they said to him, oh, wasn't that 3 years ago? And he said it hurt him so much to see it wasn't important to these outsiders, and these are kind of the voices that are always highlighted in news and big outlets, but to allow people from the inside, people who actually experienced it and lost these people, to tell their own stories, I think that's much more powerful, and it's also a practice of healing as well, to have your own voice heard.
So at Nepal Picture Library, we are repeatedly confronted by the challenge of finding the best means or methodology for presenting the material that we collect. I wanted to ask you about that, about what your methodology is that you have developed for the Langtang Memory Project, and what kind of materials has the Langtang Memory Project collated and archived, and how have you gone about processing and analyzing the materials that you collect?
So, like I mentioned before, the Langtang Memory Project is largely an archival project, but it's also an effort to document the current time now, especially in this post-disaster context, and trying to kind of learn from the Langtangpas and see how they move through this space. So far, for the archive, we started out in the beginning just crowdsourcing photos, especially from foreigners. That meant, trying to contact people who were in the Peace Corps from the late 1960s, tourists, other researchers, anyone that might have been to Langtang in the past before the earthquake. And at that time, the community wasn't necessarily ready to actively search for their own photos. They were too busy trying to find their own lives again and trying to grapple with what had happened. So that was the first major source. And that's been a really kind of special collection, because these photos come from times when people in Langtang didn't have, cameras or the means to take their own photos. So when they get to look at these photos from the past, it's this type of memory that they're happy to see in a way. It's a nostalgic feeling. Of course, there's still some feeling of loss, but it's not the feeling that they feel like when they see a photo of their house from 4 years ago. It's not there anymore. So every time I go up to Langtang, I bring a hard drive, and I have all these photos from the archive on the hard drives to show people in the community, because of course the archive is available, and it's especially available for Langtang people, but some people can't access it. They might not know how to read or use a computer, so it's really important to present to them, in my opinion. And so every time I go up the older generation especially, they're always asking me, they call it TV because it's kind of projected like this, and they think of it as a TV, and they tell me, oh, please can you show me the TV again? And it's really wonderful to kind of watch everyone gather around and discuss, like, oh, that's my grandmother, or like, oh, like, what are they doing there, things like that. So the second, after the crowdsourced, the foreign sourced material, we also salvaged some photographs. So the avalanche zone is quite large, but there were some photos that we could salvage along the rubble. So we have those as well, which speaks a lot to, the disaster and the destruction that happened of objects and the structures there. And then the last part of our archive was scans from actual family photo albums that we went to the houses in Langtang, and some people still have albums and bags of photos, and it was a nice process to kind of just sit with these people and drink tea and look through their photos, and we scanned them, and so that's also part of the archive. And then on the other side of our methods, so we're also doing things like photo voice and trying to mostly work with the Langtang youth and have them be able to tell their own stories through photography workshops and video workshops, audio recording workshops. And we've really made a big effort to keep this project and the documentation collaborative, because of course, like, it's great to have this documentation, but it's better to have it being documented by the people themselves. So we've most recently we went up to one of the most important festivals in Langtang, and that's called Drupatezi. And they haven't celebrated this festival since the earthquake happened because of the 3 years of condolences. So this was the first time, and it was really kind of a time of anxiety in a way for the community, because they weren't sure, like, how would they feel? Would they feel really upset, like, looking around and not seeing people? And it ended up being great, and so we had a team of, I think, 5 or 6 of us, and half of us were from Langtang, and we just kind of like went around and documented, and we're hoping to have this turn into a short documentary, and we'll also put this in the exhibition as well. So basically those are the methods we've been using so far.
Earlier when we were talking to plan for this talk, you were talking about how because some of the dead bodies haven't been found, you were describing how in the absence of bodies, that Langtampas were using photographs to burn photographs as a sort of like a ritual. Can you talk about that? I mean, I asked that mainly to also maybe get you to elaborate about different ways in which photographs are used and how Langtampas relate to photographs. You talked about it briefly just now as well, but to maybe get you to detail some of that. Also how Langtampas speak about photographs. And you pointed out these 2 types of photographs in your collection. One from the private collection, privately held pictures from photo albums of Langtampas themselves, and others that were sourced from foreigners and travelers and other sources. How do Langtampas view these different types of photographs differently?
Sure. So I want to go back to one of the photos we have here. So to talk about some of the dead bodies that haven't been recovered, as you saw in the first slide, the avalanche zone was really massive, and underneath it was, most of a village, and a lot people were just going through their daily life at that time. So a lot of people died. Like I said, 180 people from Langtang, and then overall over 300 people. So even today, there's been quite a lot of bodies that haven't been found, and maybe some people have only found parts of the bodies of their relatives. So during this time that I mentioned before called Bardo, they have to do, and it's in this Buddhist tradition that you have to do pujas every 7 days, and then on the 49th day is the gewa. And the other part of this is you need to burn the bodies. So the bodies that they did find, they burned them, and then the bodies that they couldn't find, the lamas and the religious leaders, they decided that it would be appropriate to use photos as a symbol of the bodies, because it's important for these people to have this ceremony to move on. The whole point of this is to have the people who passed away to go on to their next life. If they can't, they'll just stay in Bardo, and that's a very anxious state of being. And so there was a Gumba in Boda, and the local lamas and the lamas of the Gumba came together, and the community members, and they asked everyone to, bring photos of the people who had passed away that they hadn't found their bodies. And so they pasted it on this collage, and then they did the ceremony, and this is how they used the photos in order to symbolize the bodies that hadn't been found. And can you ask the second part of your question?
I forgot it now.
I'm sorry.
What did I ask, guys?
How
Yeah.
Langtang interact with photos.
Yeah, and how do they speak? Because one of the methodologies you pointed out was visual. What would you call it? The photo
voice.
Photo voice.
Yeah.
So I'm guessing you use photos to get people to talk about the past. I'm just curious to know what is there any insight you can give us about how Langtangpas tend to speak about photographs and how speak through photographs?
Okay. So Langtangpas interact with photos in a variety of different ways, especially because cameras and documenting visually is sort of a newer thing, especially for the Langtang community. They haven't, and now currently you see people with their mobile phones all the time clicking photos, and even the older people have phones, and that's great, and it's wonderful to see them documenting their own things. But in the past, they didn't have any of that technology, and so they were really reliant on having foreigners come in and take the photos themselves. And sometimes they talk about it and they say, we really didn't want our photo taken at that point. Look at how my hair looks. They didn't even ask, things like that. But they still have these photos, and I've asked that similar question to Langtangpas, because I wonder, do you mind having these photos that you didn't take, no one from your community took? And they say they do appreciate them because it's the only thing that they have from that time. They do talk about, there's certain people, certain foreigners who their collections of photos they feel closer to, and that's because those people are closer to the community. For example, there's a Japanese researcher who has been going to Langtang and doing research there since the early 70s, and now she's kind of termed as the grandmother of Langtang. It's really quite nice to see her interactions there, and those photos, they feel as if almost just a Langtangpa person took them as well. In the post-disaster context, thinking about the ways that Langtangpas have interacted with photos, I think this is the most jarring way. To think about burning photos right in front of the relatives of the people who passed away. And I've heard people say I saw my father's photo being burned, and I really felt horrible watching that. It was just this horrible sense of that was his photo, and now I don't have that either. But other ways is I've seen people they cut photos, and they make sure there's a bunch of photos that we've scanned from people's homes, and they've cut them in order to just have the person who passed away, and that's so that they can use that on their puja altar, or kind of honor the person who died in a way that if there's someone else who's still living in that photo, you can't really use it in that same way. So they literally will cut it with scissors, and some work that we've done is scan them, and they've asked us to print them out into a nicer, bigger format, and we've brought them back up to Langtang, and they've appreciated that a lot. And I see photos really as a very important part of the kind of healing process for Langtang. they display these photos really nicely in their homes. Like they're really far up into the mountains, and you have to carry up everything, on someone's head or like in your backpack. And I've seen them, they have like these beautiful frames that they bring from Kathmandu, and it's really like a special thing for them to be able to honor the people who passed away in this way.
Right, and you also talked about taking the photographs of the archive and showing it to Langtangpas. I was curious about the old photographs, the archival photographs, the Peace Corps photographs perhaps, some of which, I guess most of which, the Langtangpas mustn't have seen before, but they would probably recognize the places and the people depicted in the photographs. Can you talk about their experience of looking at old photographs? And then I'm asking this partly also because I think you noted that most of the survivors during the earthquake were older people, and there seems to be some kind of note to be made about generations. And I'm just wanting to hear from you about how older people and the younger people in Langtangpas relate to this process of archiving and looking at older materials.
Yeah. So bringing up the photos and showing them either kind of formally in like a larger setting inside of community halls or inside of someone's guest house, versus just having like sitting in someone's kitchen and they just suddenly ask me to show them the photos that we have. It's sort of a different experience, but both are really kind of fascinating in a way. The first time we did this, we only had like part of the archive with us, and we thought, maybe we'll show this for like 45 minutes and people might like it, and then we'll just keep going. And really, I think I sat there for an hour and a half going through the slides maybe 2 or 3 times, and I kept saying, like, there are not going to be any new photos, like these are all the ones I have right now. And they kept saying, it doesn't matter, we want to keep seeing this. And this was mostly the generation that's around 40 years old. These are the people who actively keep asking me to show them, and they'll call me into their houses and they'll say, like, can you show me the old photos, show me the old photos. And I was really surprised at first, because I was kind of nervous when I first brought them up. I thought this might bring up some negative emotions, like to show people what Langtang used to be, and then they look around and it's not like that anymore. But there's been a lot of positive reaction. I mean, of course there is these feelings of loss that come, a lot of the older, like the grandmothers or the grandfathers, they'll look at these things and they'll see, their friends and their relatives that aren't there anymore, their houses that aren't there, and they'll say things like, oh, we don't have anything anymore. But then I ask them, like, do you want to stop looking? I don't want to, cause you to feel too sad. And they say, no, I want to keep looking. It's this feeling of like, almost a nostalgic feeling of wanting to see the photos and the memories of the past and what Langtang was, and this almost sense of pride of like, this is our identity. This is a big point that has come out a lot in conversations with Langtangpas, that Langtang is what they feel is their identity. There's a big attachment to the place of Langtang, and even though now the landscape is completely altered, that doesn't mean that Langtang isn't their identity. And so in one of the interviews we've been taking, someone said to us, if there is no Langtang, then there is no Langtangpas. And so I think that, this attachment to the land, this attachment to their culture, and all of the way things used to look, that's really shown in these archival photos, in the photos of history in the past. And so then, just to kind of add one more note, to look at it in generations and reactions, so the older people and then the middle-aged people I've discussed, and the younger generation, I see less of like a personal reaction to these photos, because it's photos that they say, oh, like that's the Langtang of like our grandmothers, but I never saw that type of thing. Of course they're interested, but it's almost like an outsider looking at the photos, because they haven't actually seen it. There's not that sense of attachment that I see in the other generations.
I wanted to put some of our focus on forgetting as well, since we were talking about memory. Because during the Feminist Memory Project also, we've been wondering if remembering is always a desirable thing. In some ways it seems selective forgetfulness is inbuilt into the process of remembering. You talked about Bardo, which describes this transitional phase of the dead before they move on away from this world. And to build on that anecdote of how you described how the living have to perform this active ignoring of the dead by not crying, not mourning, not thinking about the dead, seeming happy and not caring about the people of the past in some ways, so that the dead can know that they are dead and that they no longer belong in this world. That made me wonder more about how we also use forgetting in our lives. Do we, as archivists, who are always talking about remembering and recording as something that's important, do we also need to consider the social life and usefulness of forgetting and of forgetfulness? Are there anecdotes you can share apart from that, from Bardo, but maybe you can also tell us more about that, from the Langtang Memory Project that can help us think more about the uses of forgetting?
Sure. So first I want to elaborate a little bit on this process of Bardo. So the belief is that when a person dies, they haven't left this world yet, so they can still see everyone living, and they still try to talk to us. And the people who are surviving them, they actually feel that they have work, they have a job in helping these people move on. And there's a distinction between how they're acting outwardly and how they're feeling inwardly. So outwardly, they're not supposed to cry, they're not supposed to show their sadness, show their weakness, because if you can't go on with your everyday work and your everyday tasks, then this person will never leave you. And so the idea isn't that you completely forget everything about the person, you don't have to stop thinking about the person, but you can't show it. It's this outward expression of being okay and not really talking about the person. And so if we think about forgetting in that way, it's also kind of tied into this idea of attachment and detachment. So for the person to go on, they have to, the person that has survived them has to detach in a way. They have to stop, they have to let them go. So that's kind of how Bardo would be involved in the work of forgetting. But on another note, there's another anecdote that I think is interesting as far as forgetting in this type of context. So about 2 years ago, I was with a young Langtang man, and we were walking between villages, and to get between the villages, we had to walk over the landslide zone. And like I said before, it's quite large and it takes a while, and this man's almost entire family had passed away in the earthquake, and specifically in that area. And so when we were going through, he just said to me, usually when I walk over this landslide zone, I try not to think about anything. I try not to remember anything. I put my head down. I don't want to see anything. Because if he sees it, it's this visual trigger of the memory, right? And he doesn't want to remember it. It's this act of trying to forget, but like the visuality of it is confronting you with that memory. And so he said to me, usually I don't want to look at anything, but since you're here and you're interested, I'll show you some things. And we walked up a little bit, and there was a piece of blue paint on the side of a piece of cement. And he said, this is where my guest house was, this is where my family died, and he said, this is where I think my mother's body still is. And so it makes quite a lot of sense to not want to think about that as you walk over it, but he talks about this idea of being confronted with it, as he mostly lives in Kathmandu now, but every time he goes up to Langtang, all of these feelings are triggered again. It's these memories, it's the landscape that completely, puts all of these memories back into your head. And when you're not in that area, you don't necessarily have to think about it. I mean, maybe it might come into your head, but it's this almost welcoming of forgetting. And not forgetting the person or not wanting to know them, but forgetting what happened and trying to move on in a way that you can digest the narrative of what happened.
I want to ask you something that I at least have been struggling with at the Feminist Memory Project, which is the realization that certain social structures and hierarchies are already in play regarding whose lives can be memorialized, resuscitated through memory projects and through our methods of memory keeping. For us, single women, and I talked briefly about this with you earlier as well, women who never got married, didn't leave behind a posterity of their own, posed a specific problem for us. And there were many single women, perhaps understandably, who had played important roles in the feminist and political movements of Nepal. So in Nepal, in the absence of secular traditions of archiving and history writing, much of the responsibility of memory keeping has fallen on families who mainly do it through formalized rituals of death anniversaries and so on, religiously sort of dictated. I have been trying to think about this during the Feminist Memory Project, about those whose memories elude these more formalized means of memory keeping. I'm guessing just because of the sheer scale and collective nature of the Langtang disaster, you must have encountered that the task of memory keeping in Langtang becomes more organized and formalized, with particular oversight from the monastery or other sorts of authorities and so on. So I don't know what exactly I mean to ask here, but can you give us a sense of how closely memory has gotten formalized and ritualized in Langtang? And what does this mean eventually? And what challenges would the formalization of memory pose?
Sure. So I think in any type of archive project trying to encompass like a whole group's history, there's bound to be someone or some part of it that's overlooked, or not intentionally, but we just don't see it. It might not be there. And the longer that I work on this project, the longer that I talk with different people, I keep uncovering different layers. Of course, when we first started the project, it kind of began with the leaders of the community, the people who had foreign friends and who could speak really good English, and they weren't shy to talk to other people outside of the community. And from that, you get into these hierarchies and these like kind of village politics and family politics, and you don't realize at first like this person doesn't like that person, right? And so we've run into a lot of that, and like you don't see at first like that they're actually trying to kind of hide this part of the archive process, of the documentation process, and you get further and you talk to more people. And so that's been my experience as far as kind of going into the politics of things. But there's another small project that we've been trying to do, I forgot to mention, which is to kind of compile a lot of the archive into a book for the community themselves, not for public consumption, but to give to the community so that they can have it. And when I was talking to one of kind of the political leaders of Langtang, it's become important to make sure that we have permission from the leaders of the community, otherwise the community won't continue to work with us. So I was talking to him, and I was saying like, this is what I think, like different sections of the archive that are becoming apparent. And he was like, there's so many subcultures of Langtang. Like there's Lama culture, and there's politics, and there's women, and there's yak herding, and there's all these things. and you just like there's just so much, and what he said isn't even the whole thing of it. And so I've been really trying to, especially as a woman, and trying to appeal to women and get women involved in the project. That's been kind of the last year's focus, on having women's voices become more present in the decision making and also in the archival process. And then the other thing are the yak herders. These are the people who, they're stuck in their yak houses, right? Because every morning and every evening they have to milk the yaks. And so I've been kind of like, as much as I can, visiting like the yak houses and trying to give them my camera or my phone or something and have them take photos, or at the very least, spending time and just having my computer and showing these photos to them. And that's been really wonderful, because these are the types of processes and projects that they just kind of get left out of because they're so busy, and they're not necessarily in the tourist industry. I think tourism is another topic that really sections off the community a lot. I mean, you can see even the changing power dynamics from before tourism into now. I mean, before the Lanos were like the powerful people of the community, right? And they still are. I mean, you still respect them, but now it's sort of the hotel owners as well. I mean, they've become like this symbol of power and of wealth. So this is what I've experienced so far, is like just trying to get through these layers, and the layers just, you realize they're just so deep, but it's important to keep going through them, and also engaging with the people who you realize aren't represented.
Right. I guess I have a lot of questions for you still, but I'm going to ask you one last one, and maybe quickly open the floor for the audience. So again, at Nepal Picture Library, our modus operandi has been to kind of collect private albums and other materials, and the idea is to put them out in a way, for public consumption. I guess in our argument is that there is a lot of legacy and historical knowledge that is preserved at homes and in domestic spaces as well. And correspondingly, the idea is probably also that archives are not only a place that preserve and produce knowledge, but also that archives are also for the production of feelings in some ways and affects. So there are ethical questions about the distinction between private and public that we probably need to be considering. You are also working mainly with private and personal collections, and I wanted to ask you, what has it meant for you to trace someone's life and put out there very intimately felt stories about suffering for public scrutiny? And I ask this partly also because both the Feminist Memory Project and the Langtang Project are digital and virtual archives. And in the world of information and social media that we live in, these distinctions between private and public sensibilities have become really hard to maintain in some ways. So what are your thoughts on this, and what are the methodological or other protocols that you have put in place to address these aspects of archiving private lives?
So this has been a really important part of our project so far. I think same with the Feminist Memory Project, especially because we are talking about people's personal lives, and to put myself in that set of shoes, I would be nervous to have that in public consumption as well. And I think that's always something important to remember. Ethics and public consumption is something we've thought about a lot, especially from the beginning. There was, in the aftermath of the earthquake, there was someone separate from our project, but someone who was trying to fundraise for the community, and they ended up putting on a website photos of all the people who passed away, all of their just faces, and the community really was pretty angry about that. They felt like, well, we didn't ask our permission, and maybe it's for a good cause, but we don't want this for public consumption. And kind of like, this was in the beginning stages of our project, and I think we really took that as a lesson to remember that this is something very sensitive. And so much of our work, I mean, we have so many images, but on our digital collection on our website, there's really not even a quarter of the things that we've collected, and that's because we want to make sure that we have the right permissions. And the other protocols that we've been using is nothing that we present, even if it's only to be presented to the Langtangpas themselves, it's always gone through at least 3 or 4 Langtangpas, having them with the final say. And I always say, you know, like I'm doing this work and I'm like working with them, but this is not my final say. I'm not from Langtang, so I'll help with all of the work, but the final say always has to be from someone from the community, and not necessarily just one person, because we have to remember there's quite a lot of perspectives within a community. And so we try to make sure that we talk to different people, show things to people personally, and then have them, you know, okay those things, and make sure that the older generation as well as the younger generation are okay with this. And especially in this context, I mean, it's very sensitive to have photos of the dead, and that could spark a lot of negative reactions, right? So we try to stay away from that, especially if we're going to be showing to a Langtangpa audience, because to just see these photos of people who passed away, it's very jarring, and if you don't have that, if you're not prepared for it, there can be really bad reactions. So we try to be very careful with all of that.
Cool. Maybe we have time for a couple of questions from the audience? Yeah?
Maybe we'll cap it up with 3 questions.
For Jennifer.
Yeah. Yeah, anyone has any questions? Limit 1 question per person.
I promise it will be a question.
Also, let me quickly say that we'll be beginning the next talk right after, so please don't leave. The presenter is already here, so we won't be taking a break.
So, yeah, this question is to Jennifer. Are you capturing any other mediums than photographs for the memory project, like audio, or I'm sure like when you show the pictures, there's a story that comes with it. Are you also capturing or archiving those things?
Yes, we've been using a couple different methods. We've been using, of course, photographs, but we've also been taking videos of pujas and festivals, but also actual like interviews where we take the interviews in the Langtang language. Of course, I don't speak the Langtang language, but we always have a Langtangpa with either me or the other person that's taking the interview. And the reason why we want it in Langtang language is so that we can also help preserve that language as well. We've also invited, in the past we've invited 2 anthropologists who focus on audio, and we've had them take out their recorders and try to take sounds of like just the land, like soundscapes, things like that, sounds of pujas, sounds of people singing, sounds of people, you know, spinning mani reels, things like that. So we try to make it as inclusive as possible, not just photographs, but as far as the historical aspect of it, we've only been able to collect photographs because in the past there was no one really doing any video documentation.
Thank you. I'm Indira Shrestha, development professional. Just wanted to ask 2 questions, not questions, for my clarity. One is, is this a part of your academic pursuit for your higher studies, or was it done strictly for this Photo Kathmandu program? Okay. The other is in this photo that you are showing, the burning of is it a brochure or people?
Yeah,
You said it was like those people whose body was not recovered, could not be recovered. Is this kind of ritualistically sort of extinguishing it, or something more identity?
Okay. So to answer your first question, this project has been going on for about 3 years now, so it's not specifically for Photo Kathmandu. The exhibition is actually a manifestation of the project itself. My co-facilitator on the project, his name is Austin Lord, and he's doing his PhD at Cornell. So I came to Nepal shortly after I finished my bachelor's degree, and I ended up working on projects like this, and I've been continuing this project. And my future, what I plan to do in the future is go back to school and continue my academic career, and I think this project will be a big part of it. And your question regarding this photo, the photos are considered to be like a symbol of the body. Because the body wasn't found, they still had to do this ritual in order for the person to be able to move on to the next life. Otherwise, this person might be stuck in what they're calling bardo, in this period of in-between. So these photos were to symbolize what couldn't be found.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. So as I said, we'll be, round of applause.
Kathmandu, Kathmandu, Kathmandu.